to you, O God, our strength and our salvation. Amen. In Luke's narrative of the resurrection, Jesus' female disciples, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and others too, came to the tomb on Easter morning with spices to anoint Jesus' body. Jesus had not received a full and proper Jewish burial, and they wanted to do it right. He deserved at least that after all he had endured. When the women arrived and found the tomb empty, they were at first perplexed. But then 2 men in dazzling clothes appeared, presumably angels, and reminded the women that Jesus had foretold that he would rise again on the 3rd day. Suddenly making sense of it all, the women rushed to tell the other disciples about Jesus' resurrection. Here's how Luke tells what happens next. The women's words seemed to the apostles an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves. Then he went home, amazed at what had happened. Not sure if he told anyone. Well, the next episode in Luke's narrative features 2 disciples on the road to the town of Emmaus. They are talking about the news of Jesus' resurrection when a stranger joins them on their journey. The stranger, of course, is Jesus, who they are not yet able to recognize. Indeed, even after many miles of walking, they still do not know it is Jesus who is with them. It is not until they sit down to share a meal and the stranger breaks the bread that they are suddenly able to recognize him as Jesus. And this is all a bit confounding, isn't it? If Jesus' resurrection had returned him to his friends in the flesh, why do they often seem to have difficulty recognizing him? Why do they seem to have trouble perceiving Jesus, trouble seeing him? The resurrected Jesus must have been different somehow, but still definitely Jesus, because his friends eventually could see him and did see him. But even when Jesus became recognizable, he rarely stayed around for long, and never long enough for his friends to get used to having him back. Jesus's post-resurrection appearances seem to have been brief, even momentary encounters, transforming yet transient, nearly impossible to grasp, fleeting. Jesus didn't set up camp, regather the disciples, and get back to business. Rather, he was everywhere at once, making contact and then departing before his friends had time to make much sense of it all. Jesus's modes of appearance and disappearance after the resurrection were also a bit difficult for the disciples to comprehend. He didn't make conventional entrances or exits. He seemed to just suddenly be there on at least a few occasions. He didn't quite arrive out of thin air, but something in that vicinity. Indeed, this was precisely the experience of the disciples in our gospel reading from Luke today, which takes place immediately following the Emmaus narrative. The 2 disciples who had met Jesus on the road and recognized him in the breaking of the bread had just returned to Jerusalem. They were excitedly telling the other disciples what had happened on their journey. And then, as Luke tells it, suddenly Jesus himself stood among the disciples and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and terrified and thought that they were seeing a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you frightened, and why do doubts arise in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet. See that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have." And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. And what stands out so strongly here is that Jesus offers his body to the disciples as verification of who he says he is. Something about his fleshly presence doesn't quite compute for the disciples at first, though. But his wounds do, those very particular absences in his flesh. They know his wounds, so they can know him by his wounds. Yes, surely this is Jesus, the one whose hands and feet were pierced by nails. They knew the story of those wounds. Those wounds, in fact, tell their own story. And Jesus invited the disciples to touch him, to touch his wounded hands and feet. And in so doing, Jesus reminds the disciples that they are part of the story of his wounds, a story of pain and betrayal, of healing and forgiveness. Because in no small part, even though the word isn't mentioned much, these post-resurrection encounters with Jesus are acts of forgiveness. This offering of his wounded body is an act of forgiveness. Jesus doesn't ask, "Why weren't you there?" Jesus simply offers himself. And in offering himself, he seeks to renew relationship, seeks to repair and restore and reconcile. In a word, as Deacon Karen explicated it recently, Jesus comes to the disciples bearing shalom, shalom, peace and so much more than peace. And of course, any vision of shalom is incomplete without food and without the affirmation of our bodiliness that eating entails. And so after Jesus has offered his hands and his feet to the disciples, Luke continues his narrative in this way. While in their joy, the disciples were disbelieving and still wondering, Jesus said to them, "Have you anything to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. Sharing food is so important throughout the Gospels. And here, in the simplest act of eating a piece of fish, Jesus both affirms his humanity and makes himself the disciples' guest, the recipient of their hospitality. So much of what we've lost over this past year is the vital reciprocity of giving and receiving, of playing the ever-shifting roles of host and guest. And I think it's more of a loss than many of us have yet realized or acknowledged. We are gravely out of practice in the subtle art of gathering with one another, of helping one another to feel at home, of helping one another to feel welcome, although we've done so here on Zoom anyway. When we are able to return to the fullness of the Eucharist, of coffee hour, of community meals, we will have to rediscover our capacities to both gracefully offer and receive hospitality. In no small part, the art of being a Christian community is the art of inspiring one another toward practicing unconventional, unexpected, and sometimes even uncomfortable hospitality. As we've witnessed once again this past week, the killing of children by police officers. As we've witnessed once again, violence motivated by race-based hatred. As we've wondered how on earth to make this world a more hospitable place. I wonder if there's something in this encounter with the resurrected Jesus for us to hold on to. Offering up our woundedness and asking for a bite to eat. I wonder if these small but brave practices are really what can ultimately make the world a different place. Receiving one another differently here at church, and then with lots of good practice, being able to receive others differently too in ever expanding orbits. Our worlds have become too small, you see, even smaller during this pandemic time. So when we can once again gather, perhaps this might become our practice, our discipline, offering up our woundedness and asking for a bite to eat, receiving one another's woundedness and offering something to eat. The disciples knew Jesus by his wounds. Perhaps we are meant to know one another by our wounds too. May it be so. Amen.